Sarah Martinez had always been told she wasn't cut out for the military. At barely 5 feet tall, with a quiet voice that often got lost in crowded rooms, she seemed an unlikely candidate for the armed forces. Her own family questioned her decision. Her high school guidance counselor suggested more suitable career paths, and even a recruitment officer had hesitated before signing her papers. But sometimes the most powerful storms come in the smallest packages, and Sarah was about to prove that courage doesn't come with a height requirement. In a world where first impressions often become lasting judgments, where doubt can spread like wildfire through a room full of seasoned military personnel, one young woman was about to shatter every preconceived notion about what it takes to serve her country. This is the story of how Sarah Martinez went from being the person everyone underestimated to becoming the soldier everyone wanted on their team. It's a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about strength, determination, and the true meaning of heroism. What happened in that training facility would not only change Sarah's life forever, but would also force a decorated colonel to confront his own biases and redefine his understanding of what makes a true warrior. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, but in the moments when we choose to see beyond the surface and recognize the extraordinary potential that lies within the most unexpected people. Sarah Martinez stepped off the bus at Fort Benning, Georgia, clutching a worn duffel bag that seemed almost as big as she was. The Georgia heat hit her like a wall, but it wasn't the temperature that made her stomach churn. It was the sight of her fellow recruits, most of whom towered over her by at least a foot and looked like they could bench press her entire family. She had grown up in a small town in New Mexico where everyone knew everyone, and where her dream of joining the Army had been met with everything from gentle discouragement to outright laughter. Her mother, Rosa, had spent months trying to convince her to consider nursing school instead. Her father, Miguel, a construction worker with calloused hands and a gentle heart, had simply asked, "Mija, are you sure about this?" Her older brother Carlos had been more direct, calling her loca and predicting she'd be home within a week. But Sarah had always been different. While other kids her age were content with the familiar rhythms of small-town life, she felt a restless energy that seemed to pull her towards something bigger. She had excelled in school, not because she was the smartest kid in her class, but because she refused to give up when things got difficult. Her teachers noticed how she would stay after class to work on problems that stumped her, how she would read the same chapter 3 times if that's what it took to understand it. The decision to enlist had come during her senior year of high school, after watching a documentary about military engineers who built schools and hospitals in war-torn countries. Something about the combination of service and purpose spoke to her in a way that college brochures and career pamphlets never had. She wanted to be part of something that mattered, something that could make a real difference in the world. The recruitment process had been humbling. Staff Sergeant Johnson, the local recruiter, had been professional but skeptical. During their first meeting, he had asked her 3 times if she was sure she wouldn't prefer the Air Force or Navy, branches he considered more suitable for someone like her. When she insisted on the Army, specifically requesting combat engineering, his eyebrows had nearly disappeared into his hairline. The physical fitness requirements had been her biggest hurdle. Sarah had never been athletic in the traditional sense. She couldn't run fast, couldn't lift heavy weights, and had never played competitive sports. But she discovered she had something that many natural athletes lacked: an absolute refusal to quit. She spent 6 months before shipping out running every morning before school, doing push-ups until her arms screamed, and working with Carlos in their father's garage to build up her strength. Now, standing in the reception area at Fort Benning, surrounded by young men and women who looked like they had stepped out of Fitness magazine, Sarah felt every one of her 5 feet and 98 pounds. The drill sergeants moved through the crowd like sharks, their voices cutting through the humid air as they began the process of transforming civilians into soldiers. Drill Sergeant Williams approached her group, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and a voice that seemed to vibrate through the ground. His eyes swept over the new recruits, lingering on Sarah with an expression that was difficult to read. It wasn't quite dismissive, but it wasn't encouraging either. "Welcome to Fort Benning," he announced, his voice carrying across the formation. "For the next 14 weeks, this will be your home, your school, and your testing ground. Some of you will discover reserves of strength you never knew you had. Others will discover that what they thought was strength was nothing more than wishful thinking." Sarah felt those words settle in her chest like stones. She had heard variations of this speech in movies and books, but hearing it in person, feeling the weight of the drill sergeant's gaze, made it real in a way that nothing had prepared her for. The first few hours were a whirlwind of paperwork, medical checks, and equipment distribution. Sarah struggled with gear that seemed designed for people twice her size. Her helmet wobbled on her head despite the chin strap, and her uniform hung loose despite being the smallest size available. She watched other recruits joke and laugh with each other, forming quick friendships based on shared backgrounds or common interests, but she felt disconnected from it all. During the initial fitness assessment, Sarah's worst fears seemed to be confirmed. She completed the minimum number of push-ups with her arms shaking, finished the run in a time that was respectable, but not impressive, and struggled with pull-ups in a way that drew sideways glances from her fellow recruits. She wasn't the worst performer in the group, but she was far from the best, and in an environment where physical capability was paramount, that felt like a significant disadvantage. That evening, as the recruits were settling into their barracks, Sarah overheard a conversation that would haunt her for weeks to come. Two of her bunkmates, Kelly and Jennifer, were discussing the day's events in hushed tones. "I don't know what that little girl is thinking," Kelly whispered, apparently referring to Sarah. "This isn't summer camp. People could get hurt if she can't keep up. Maybe she'll realize it on her own and drop out," Jennifer replied. "It will be better for everyone." Sarah lay in her narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of 40 women trying to sleep in the same room. She thought about her family back home, about the farewell dinner where her grandmother had pressed a small silver cross in her hand and whispered prayers in Spanish. She thought about her high school guidance counselor, Mr. Peterson, who had suggested she consider more realistic options for someone with her physical limitations. But mostly, she thought about why she was there. It wasn't to prove anything to Kelly and Jennifer or even to her family back home. She was there because she believed she had something to offer, some contribution to make that went beyond physical strength or natural athletic ability. She had always been the kind of person who found solutions when others saw only problems, who remained calm when others panicked, who asked the right questions when everyone else was focused on the wrong answers. The next morning brought their first real training exercise, a basic obstacle course designed to assess each recruit's physical capabilities and mental resilience. Sarah watched as her fellow recruits tackled the various challenges with varying degrees of success. Some powered through with raw strength, others relied on natural agility, and a few struggled but persevered through determination alone. When her turn came, Sarah approached each obstacle methodically. She couldn't muscle her way over the wall like some of the larger recruits, so she found the most efficient way to climb it. She couldn't sprint through the tire run like the former track stars, so she focused on maintaining steady rhythm and perfect form. She couldn't dominate the rope climb through upper body strength alone, so she used her legs more effectively than anyone else in her group. Drill Sergeant Williams watched her progress with an expression that gave nothing away. When she completed the course, he made a note on his clipboard but offered no comment. Sarah had no idea whether her performance was satisfactory or disappointing, but she knew she had given everything she had. As the days turned into weeks, a pattern began to emerge. In purely physical challenges, Sarah consistently performed in the middle of the pack. She wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but she wasn't the slowest or the weakest either. More importantly, she never quit, never complained, and never asked for special consideration. She simply worked harder than anyone else to achieve results that came more naturally to her physically gifted peers. But it was in the classroom portions of their training that Sarah began to distinguish herself in ways that surprised even her. Military tactics, which some recruits found dry and theoretical, came alive for her. She could visualize how different strategies would play out in real situations, could anticipate potential problems, and identify creative solutions. When their instructors posed hypothetical scenarios, Sarah often offered insights that impressed both her fellow recruits and the teaching staff. During one memorable class on combat engineering, the instructor presented a problem involving the demolition of a bridge while minimizing damage to surrounding civilian infrastructure. While other recruits focused on the technical aspects of explosives and structural weak points, Sarah raised her hand with a different perspective. "What if we don't destroy the bridge at all?" she asked, her quiet voice cutting through the discussion. "What if we make it unusable without destroying it? That way, it can be repaired quickly once the tactical situation changes, and the local population isn't cut off from essential services any longer than necessary." The instructor, Captain Rodriguez, paused and looked at her with new interest. "Explain your thinking, Martinez." Sarah stood up, her small frame somehow commanding attention as she walked to the front of the classroom. "Well, sir, if we remove key support cables or disable the electrical systems that operate a drawbridge, we achieve the immediate tactical objective without creating long-term humanitarian problems. The enemy can't use it for their purposes, but we're not destroying infrastructure that the local population depends on for their livelihood." The room fell silent as her fellow recruits and the instructor processed her suggestion. Captain Rodriguez nodded slowly, making notes on his tablet. "That's innovative thinking, Martinez. You're considering the broader implications of tactical decisions, not just the immediate military objectives." For the first time since arriving at Fort Benning, Sarah felt like she might actually belong there. She had found something she could contribute that went beyond physical strength or natural athletic ability. She could think differently, see problems from angles that others missed, and find solutions that balanced multiple priorities. Word of her classroom performance began to spread among the training staff. Instructors started calling on her more frequently, using her questions and observations to drive discussions that helped the entire platoon understand complex concepts more deeply. Her fellow recruits began to see her differently too. The quiet girl who struggled with pull-ups was also the one who helped them understand map reading, who could explain radio procedures in ways that made sense, and who always had thoughtful questions that improved everyone's learning. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Sarah saw herself. The doubt that had followed her from her small hometown in New Mexico began to recede, replaced by a growing confidence that she had made the right choice. She might not look like a traditional soldier, but she was learning that being a soldier involved much more than physical prowess. It required intelligence, creativity, resilience, and the ability to work effectively as part of a team. These were qualities she possessed in abundance, even if they weren't immediately obvious to casual observers. As her first month of basic training drew to a close, Sarah reflected on how much had already changed. She was stronger physically, more confident mentally, and clearer about her purpose than she had ever been. The girl who had stepped off the bus, clutching her oversized duffel bag, was evolving into someone who belonged in uniform, who had earned her place through dedication and intelligence rather than natural physical gifts. But she knew the real tests were still ahead. Basic training was just the beginning, and she would need to continue proving herself every day if she wanted to achieve her ultimate goal of becoming a combat engineer. The doubt might have filled the room when she first arrived, but Sarah Martinez was beginning to fill it with something much more powerful: the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone else define your limits. The morning alarm at 0500 hours had become as familiar as breathing to Sarah, but today felt different. Week 6 of basic training marked the beginning of advanced field exercises, and the atmosphere in the barracks carried an electric tension that hadn't been there during the earlier phases of training. Today, they would be tested not just as individual soldiers, but as a cohesive unit facing scenarios designed to simulate real combat conditions. Sarah had spent the previous evening carefully cleaning and organizing her gear, a habit that had earned her recognition from Drill Sergeant Williams for attention to detail. Unlike some of her fellow recruits who treated equipment maintenance as a chore, Sarah understood that in real situations, properly functioning gear could mean the difference between mission success and disaster. She checked her radio 3 times, ensured her medical kit was properly stocked, and verified that every piece of equipment was exactly where it should be. The field exercise began before dawn, with the entire company moving out to a remote section of the base that had been designed to replicate various combat environments. Sarah's platoon was assigned to secure and hold a simulated village while gathering intelligence about enemy movements in the area. It was exactly the kind of complex, multifaceted challenge that separated soldiers who could follow orders from soldiers who could think critically under pressure. As they moved through the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah noticed details that others seemed to miss. The way shadows fell across certain buildings, creating concealment opportunities. The positioning of obstacles that could provide cover during a firefight. The sight lines that would be crucial for communication between team members. Her mind automatically cataloged these observations, filing them away for potential use later in exercise. Platoon Sergeant Hayes, a veteran of 3 overseas deployments, had been watching Sarah's progress with growing interest over the past several weeks. Unlike some of the drill instructors who focused primarily on physical performance, Hayes valued tactical thinking and adaptability. He had noticed how Sarah approached problems methodically, how she asked questions that revealed deep understanding of underlying principles, and how she remained calm under pressure when other recruits became flustered. The first phase of the exercise required the platoon to establish a perimeter around the village while avoiding detection by opposing forces played by senior training personnel. Sarah's squad was assigned to the eastern approach, a route that offered good concealment, but required careful navigation through a series of ditches and abandoned buildings. As they moved into position, Sarah noticed something that made her signal for a halt. Through the morning mist, she had caught a glimpse of movement that didn't match the natural rhythm of the environment. While other squad members focused on reaching their assigned positions, Sarah took time to carefully observe the area ahead. "Johnson," she whispered to her squad leader, pointing toward a cluster of trees about 50 meters away. "There's something off about that tree line. The shadows aren't moving naturally with the wind." Private Johnson, a former college football player who had initially dismissed Sarah as too small to be useful, looked where she was pointing. At first, he saw nothing unusual, but as he watched more carefully, following Sarah's guidance about what to look for, he began to see it too. There was indeed something artificial about the movement patterns in that area. "You think it's an observation post?" Johnson asked, his tone showing new respect for Sarah's tactical awareness. "Could be," Sarah replied, studying the terrain with the intensity she had once reserved for difficult math problems in high school. "But if it is, they've positioned it to watch the main approach route. We could circle around to the north and come up behind them, or we could create a distraction that draws their attention away from our actual objective." Johnson found himself in the unusual position of asking a fellow recruit for tactical advice. Sarah's suggestion demonstrated understanding that went beyond the basic level they had been trained to. She wasn't just thinking about completing their immediate assignment. She was considering how their actions would affect the broader mission and how to gain tactical advantage through intelligence and positioning rather than direct confrontation. They decided to implement Sarah's flanking suggestion, a decision that proved prescient when they discovered that the suspicious area did indeed contain a simulated enemy observation post. By approaching from an unexpected direction, they were able to neutralize the position without being detected, earning praise from the evaluating instructors and setting their squad up for success in the next phase of the exercise. As the exercise continued throughout the day, Sarah's contributions became increasingly valuable to her squad's performance. During a simulated medical emergency, Her calm demeanor and systematic approach to problem-solving helped stabilize a wounded team member while under simulated fire. When their radio equipment malfunctioned during a critical communication window, Sarah's understanding of backup procedures and improvised signal techniques allowed them to maintain contact with command. But it was during the final phase of the exercise that Sarah's unique combination of tactical thinking and moral clarity truly distinguished her. The scenario involved gathering intelligence from simulated civilian sources in the village, a task that required balancing military objectives with ethical considerations about treatment of noncombatants. Some squads approached the task with heavy-handed tactics, treating the role-playing civilian actors as obstacles to be overcome rather than people to be protected. Others became so focused on avoiding cultural mistakes that they failed to gather the intelligence necessary for mission success. Sarah's squad, with her increasingly prominent voice in tactical discussions, found a different approach. "We're not just here to complete a mission," Sarah explained during a brief planning session. "We're supposed to be protecting these people, not just gathering information from them. If we treat them like the enemy, we're failing at our larger purpose." Her suggestion was to approach the civilian interactions as genuine relationship-building opportunities. Instead of demanding information, they would offer assistance with daily tasks, while naturally engaging in conversations that might reveal useful intelligence. It was a more time-intensive approach, but one that aligned military necessity with humanitarian principles. The strategy proved remarkably effective. By helping simulated villagers with daily tasks and engaging in respectful conversation, Sarah's squad gathered more detailed and accurate intelligence than any other unit in the exercise. The civilian role players, many of whom were military personnel themselves, later commented on how much more realistic and productive the interactions felt when approached with genuine respect and cultural sensitivity. Colonel Patterson, the commanding officer overseeing the entire exercise, had been monitoring various squads throughout the day through radio communications and reports from evaluating personnel. By late afternoon, Sarah's name had appeared in multiple positive reports from different instructors, an unusual occurrence for a recruit only 6 weeks into basic training. Curiosity prompted Colonel Patterson to observe Sarah's squad directly during the final phase of the exercise. He positioned himself where he could watch their approach to the civilian interaction scenario, expecting to see standard execution of established procedures. Instead, he witnessed something that surprised him. A small recruit he had barely noticed before taking a leadership role in developing an innovative approach that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both tactical requirements and ethical responsibilities. Sarah wasn't officially in a leadership position within her squad, but her fellow recruits had naturally begun looking to her for guidance on complex decisions. Her quiet confidence and consistently sound judgment had earned their respect in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength or traditional military bearing. She had become what instructors called a natural leader, someone who influences through competence and character rather than rank or authority. When the exercise concluded, the after-action review revealed that Sarah's squad had achieved the highest overall performance rating of any unit in the company. They had completed all tactical objectives while demonstrating superior ethical decision-making and innovative problem-solving. The evaluating instructors specifically noted the squad's approach to civilian interactions as a model for how such scenarios should be handled. Platoon Sergeant Hayes pulled Sarah aside after the formal debrief. "Martinez," he said, his usually stern expression softened by what might have been pride, "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I don't often see recruits who understand the bigger picture the way you do. You're not just learning to be a soldier. You're learning to be the kind of soldier the Army actually needs." That evening, as the exhausted recruits cleaned equipment and prepared for the next day's training, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed over the past 6 weeks. The whispered doubts from her bunkmates had been replaced by requests for help with tactical problems and study sessions. Fellow recruits who had initially dismissed her now actively sought her opinions on everything from equipment optimization to ethical dilemmas presented in their classroom scenarios. But perhaps the most significant change was internal. Sarah had discovered that her tendency to think differently, to approach problems from unexpected angles, wasn't a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be developed. The military, she was learning, needed people who could see beyond conventional solutions, who could balance competing priorities, and who could find ways to accomplish missions while maintaining the values that justified those missions in the first place. Kelly and Jennifer, her former bunkmates who had questioned her presence in the program, now regularly asked for her help with tactical planning exercises. The transformation in their attitude reflected a broader shift in how the entire platoon viewed her. She was no longer seen as someone who might not be able to keep up, but as someone whose insights and perspective made everyone else better at their jobs. During evening personal time, Sarah wrote a letter to her family back in New Mexico, describing not just the challenges of basic training, but the growing confidence she felt in her chosen path. She told them about the day's exercise, about the respect she was earning from fellow soldiers and instructors, and about her increasing certainty that she had found her calling. "I know I don't look like what people expect when they think of soldier," she wrote, "but I'm learning that being a good soldier involves much more than physical strength. It requires intelligence, creativity, moral courage, and the ability to work effectively with people from all different backgrounds. These are things I can do well, and every day I feel more confident that this is where I belong." As she sealed the letter and prepared for sleep, Sarah thought about the weeks of training still ahead. She knew there would be more challenges, more opportunities to prove herself, and undoubtedly more situations where her unconventional approach to problem-solving would be tested. But for the first time since stepping off that bus at Fort Benning, she felt truly confident that she would not just survive the experience, but excel at it. The doubt that had once filled rooms when she entered them was being replaced by something else entirely. Recognition that sometimes the most valuable perspectives come from the most unexpected sources, and that real strength often has very little to do with physical size or traditional markers of military bearing. Sarah Martinez was becoming the kind of soldier she had always believed she could be, and her fellow soldiers were beginning to see what she had always known was possible. 3 weeks before graduation from basic training, Sarah Martinez faced her greatest challenge yet. The company was preparing for the culminating field exercise, a 5-day simulation that would test everything they had learned over the previous 3 months. Unlike previous exercises, this one would be evaluated not just by training personnel, but by a panel of officers including Colonel Patterson himself, who would be identifying candidates for advanced leadership schools. The exercise scenario was complex, a humanitarian crisis in a war-torn region requiring military intervention to protect civilian populations while gathering intelligence about hostile forces in the area. Each platoon would be assigned specific objectives, but the overall success of the mission would depend on coordination between units and adaptation to changing circumstances. It was designed to identify recruits who could think beyond their individual assignments and consider the broader implications of their actions. Sarah's platoon received their briefing on a humid Tuesday morning that felt thick with anticipation. Platoon Sergeant Hayes announced that, unlike previous exercises, this one would rotate leadership responsibilities among the recruits themselves. Each day, a different recruit would serve as acting platoon leader, making tactical decisions and coordinating with other units. It was an opportunity for emerging leaders to demonstrate their capabilities under realistic pressure. The assignment list was posted that afternoon. Sarah's name appeared as acting platoon leader for day 3, the middle of the exercise when situations typically became most complex and unpredictable. She felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded her of the feeling she'd had before taking the SAT senior year of high school, when everything she had worked for seemed to hang in the balance of a single test. The first 2 days of the exercise established the scenario's baseline conditions. Sarah's platoon, under the leadership of other recruits, performed competently, but without particular distinction. They completed their assigned missions, maintained good communication with higher command, and demonstrated solid tactical fundamentals. But Sarah noticed opportunities being missed, coordination problems that created inefficiencies, and decision-making processes that focused on avoiding mistakes rather than achieving optimal outcomes. On Tuesday evening, as she prepared to assume leadership responsibilities the following morning, Sarah spent several hours studying maps, reviewing intelligence reports, and considering how to improve her platoon's performance. She approached the task with the same methodical preparation that had characterized her academic success in high school, breaking complex problems into manageable components and identifying the key factors that would determine success or failure. Her analysis revealed several issues that had been limiting the platoon's effectiveness. Communication with other units was technically correct, but lacked the detailed coordination that could enhance mutual support. Individual squad assignments were being executed in isolation rather than as integrated components of a larger plan. Most significantly, the platoon was responding to situations rather than anticipating them, missing opportunities to gain tactical advantage through proactive thinking. Wednesday morning brought Sarah's first real test of leadership under field conditions. The day's scenario involved establishing a secure perimeter around a refugee camp while investigating reports of hostile forces in the surrounding area. It was exactly the kind of multifaceted challenge that required balancing humanitarian responsibilities with military objectives. Sarah began by calling a briefing that surprised her fellow recruits with its level of detail and strategic thinking. Instead of simply relaying orders from higher command, she had integrated those orders into a comprehensive plan that addressed potential contingencies and maximized opportunities for success. She had studied the terrain carefully enough to identify alternate routes, backup communication procedures, and mutual support positions that weren't specified in the original orders, but would significantly improve their tactical situation. Our primary mission is protecting the civilian population, she explained, using a stick to draw diagrams in the dirt as her squad leaders gathered around. But we can't do that effectively if we're just reacting to threats as they develop. We need to think ahead, anticipate problems, and position ourselves to handle multiple scenarios. Her approach impressed not just her fellow recruits, but also Captain Rodriguez, who was observing the exercise as part of the evaluation team. Rodriguez had been tracking Sarah's progress since her memorable performance in the combat engineering class months earlier, and he was curious to see how her tactical thinking would translate to leadership responsibilities. The morning phase of the exercise unfolded smoothly under Sarah's leadership. Her emphasis on proactive positioning and detailed coordination allowed the platoon to establish their perimeter more efficiently than any unit had managed in previous iterations of the exercise. When a simulated medical emergency occurred among the civilian role players, her predetermined medical support procedures allowed for rapid response without compromising the platoon's tactical posture. But the real test came during the afternoon phase, when the exercise scenario took an unexpected turn. Intelligence reports indicated that hostile forces were planning to attack the refugee camp using tactics that would deliberately target civilian areas. The conventional response would be to strengthen defensive positions and request additional support from higher command. Sarah recognized that conventional approaches might not be sufficient to protect the civilian population from tactics specifically designed to exploit traditional defensive postures. During a brief planning session, Sarah proposed an unconventional solution that demonstrated the kind of innovative thinking that had characterized her performance throughout training. Instead of purely defensive positioning, she suggested a limited offensive operation designed to disrupt hostile preparations before they could threaten the civilian area. It was a complex proposal that required precise timing and coordination, but one that could potentially prevent civilian casualties while achieving the broader mission objectives. The proposal required approval from the exercise command structure, represented by Colonel Patterson himself. Sarah found herself in the unprecedented position of briefing a full colonel on tactical recommendations as a recruit still weeks away from graduation. The moment carried weight that went far beyond the exercise itself. It was an opportunity to demonstrate that her months of training had developed not just tactical competence, but the kind of strategic thinking that the military needed from its future leaders. Colonel Patterson listened carefully as Sarah explained her reasoning, asked probing questions about potential risks and resource requirements, and challenged her assumptions about enemy capabilities and intentions. Throughout the discussion, Sarah maintained the calm, analytical approach that had become her trademark, acknowledging uncertainties while clearly articulating why she believed her proposed course of action offered the best chance of mission success. Martinez, Colonel Patterson said after several minutes of discussion, "Your proposal shows impressive tactical thinking, but it also involves significant risks. How do you balance those risks against the potential benefits?" Sarah's response revealed the depth of her understanding about military decision-making in complex situations. "Sir, every option involves risks. The question is whether we're choosing risks that we can control and mitigate or accepting risks that are imposed on us by enemy actions. My proposal involves risks that we can manage through careful planning and preparation. The conventional approach involves risks that depend entirely on enemy decisions about when and how to attack civilian areas." Colonel Patterson approved the mission, but with the caveat that Sarah would be personally responsible for adapting to changing circumstances and ensuring the safety of both military personnel and civilians. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes leadership challenge that separated competent soldiers from exceptional ones. The execution of Sarah's plan required coordination between multiple squads operating in different areas, precise timing of movement and communication, and constant adaptation to evolving intelligence about enemy positions. Sarah established a command post that allowed her to maintain contact with all elements of the operation while monitoring the overall tactical situation. Her small stature, which had once seemed like a disadvantage, proved beneficial in this context, allowing her to move quickly between positions and maintain the kind of hands-on leadership that inspired confidence in her subordinates. As the afternoon progressed, the exercise scenario became increasingly complex. Simulated enemy forces adapted their tactics in response to the platoon's proactive measures, creating new challenges that required rapid decision-making and flexible implementation. Sarah's emphasis on thorough preparation proved invaluable as she adapted predetermined contingency plans to address situations that couldn't have been fully anticipated in advance. The culminating moment came when intelligence reports indicated that hostile forces had changed their approach entirely, abandoning their original plan in favor of a direct assault on a different section of the refugee camp. Sarah faced a critical decision: continue with her original operation or rapidly redeploy her forces to address the new threat. The choice required balancing the tactical advantages gained through her proactive approach against the immediate need to respond to an evolving threat. Her decision to split her forces, using some elements to complete the original mission while rapidly redeploying others to address the new threat, demonstrated the kind of adaptive leadership that military professionals spend years developing. It was a complex solution that required precise execution and constant communication, but one that maximized the platoon's ability to address multiple priorities simultaneously. The exercise concluded with Sarah's platoon achieving the highest performance rating of any unit in the company's history. They had successfully protected the civilian population, gathered crucial intelligence about enemy capabilities, and demonstrated tactical flexibility that impressed the entire evaluation team. More importantly, they had accomplished these objectives while maintaining the ethical standards and humanitarian focus that distinguish professional military operations from mere violence. During the after-action review, Colonel Patterson addressed the assembled recruits with comments that would be remembered long after the exercise details were forgotten. "Today, we witnessed something remarkable," he said, his gaze settling on Sarah. We saw leadership that wasn't based on rank or authority, but on competence, character, and the ability to inspire others to achieve more than they thought possible. That evening, as the exhausted recruits cleaned equipment and prepared for the final weeks of training, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since she first arrived at Fort Benning. The young woman who had been dismissed as too small and too quiet had demonstrated leadership capabilities that impressed seasoned officers and earned the respect of fellow soldiers who now saw her as someone they would willingly follow into difficult situations. But perhaps the most significant development was how Sarah now viewed herself. The doubt and uncertainty that had shadowed her throughout adolescence had been replaced by quiet confidence based on proven performance. She had discovered that leadership wasn't about conforming to traditional expectations, but about understanding people and situations deeply enough to find solutions that others might miss. Captain Rodriguez approached her as she finished organizing her gear. "Martinez," he said, "I've been asked to recommend candidates for officer candidate school. Your performance today and throughout training suggests that you have the potential to be not just a good soldier, but a good leader of soldiers. Would you be interested in exploring that opportunity?" The offer represented possibilities that Sarah had never seriously considered when she first decided to enlist. Officer candidate school would mean additional training, greater responsibilities, and opportunities to influence military policy and strategy at levels where her innovative thinking could have significant impact. It would also mean taking on roles where the decisions she made could affect the lives and safety of numerous people under her command. As she considered Captain Rodriguez's offer, Sarah thought about the young woman who had stepped off the bus at Fort Benning 3 months earlier. That person had believed she could contribute something valuable to military service, but had wondered whether others would recognize that contribution. Now, the question had shifted from whether she belonged in the military to how much responsibility she was prepared to accept for leading others. Her answer, when it came, reflected the confidence and clarity that had characterized her performance throughout training. "Yes, sir. I believe I can contribute effectively as an officer, and I'm prepared to accept the responsibilities that come with that role." The conversation marked a turning point not just in Sarah's military career, but in her understanding of her own capabilities and potential. She had proven that exceptional leadership could come from unexpected sources, that innovative thinking was as valuable as physical strength, and that sometimes the most important battles are won through intelligence and character rather than conventional military virtues. As she prepared for the final weeks of basic training, Sarah Martinez knew that her journey was just beginning. But she also knew that she had already achieved something remarkable. She had transformed not just herself, but the perceptions of everyone around her about what it meant to be a soldier and a leader in the modern military. The final phase of basic training arrived with an unexpected twist that would test everything Sarah Martinez had learned about leadership, adaptability, and perseverance. Just days before the culminating graduation ceremony, Fort Benning received orders to conduct an emergency response exercise that would simulate disaster relief operations in a major metropolitan area. The scenario was based on recent real-world events where military personnel had been called upon to assist civilian authorities during a catastrophic hurricane that had devastated coastal communities. Unlike previous training exercises that followed predictable patterns and established protocols, this emergency simulation would require recruits to operate in chaotic, rapidly changing conditions where standard procedures might not apply, and creative problem-solving would be essential. Most significantly, the exercise would be conducted under the observation of a congressional delegation that was evaluating military training effectiveness as part of a defense budget review. Colonel Patterson announced the exercise parameters during a company formation that crackled with nervous energy. The presence of civilians in expensive suits taking notes and asking questions added pressure that none of the recruits had experienced before. Sarah noticed how some of her fellow soldiers seemed intimidated by the additional scrutiny. their usual confidence replaced by cautious uncertainty about making mistakes in front of such high-profile observers. The scenario began with Sarah's company receiving orders to establish emergency shelters and medical facilities in a simulated disaster area where normal infrastructure had been destroyed. They would need to coordinate with civilian authorities, manage supplies and logistics, and provide assistance to distressed population groups played by volunteer actors from local communities. Success would be measured not just by military efficiency, but by their ability to provide genuine humanitarian assistance under difficult circumstances. Sarah found herself assigned as one of 4 squad leaders responsible for different aspects of the operation. Her specific assignment involved establishing a medical triage facility and coordinating with civilian medical personnel to provide emergency care for simulated disaster victims. It was exactly the kind of complex, multifaceted challenge that required balancing technical military skills with humanitarian sensitivity and cultural awareness. The first complication arose almost immediately. The designated location for the medical facility had been damaged in the simulated disaster, forcing Sarah to find an alternative site that would meet both medical requirements and security considerations. While other squad leaders focused on implementing their original plans with minor modifications, Sarah recognized that the changed circumstances required fundamental reconsideration of how to achieve their objectives. Her solution demonstrated the kind of adaptive thinking that had characterized her performance throughout training. Instead of simply finding a different building to serve the same function, Sarah identified an opportunity to create a distributed medical network that could serve a larger population more effectively than a single centralized facility. By establishing multiple smaller treatment stations connected through coordinated communication and transportation, her approach could provide faster response times and better resource utilization. The proposal required approval from the exercise command structure, but it also needed buy-in from the civilian medical personnel who would be working alongside military personnel in the operation. Sarah found herself in the position of explaining military procedures to civilian doctors and nurses while simultaneously adapting those procedures to accommodate civilian medical practices and ethical standards. Dr. Elizabeth Chun, a civilian emergency physician participating in the exercise, initially expressed skepticism about Sarah's distributed approach. "The plan sounds innovative," she said during their first coordination meeting, "but disaster medical care requires centralized resources and coordinated protocols. How do you ensure quality control and resource allocation across multiple sites?" Sarah's response demonstrated how much she had learned about presenting complex ideas clearly and addressing practical concerns directly. "You're absolutely right about the importance of coordination and quality control," she acknowledged. "That's why my proposal includes standardized protocols for each site, regular rotation of senior medical personnel between locations, and communication systems that allow real-time consultation between sites for complex cases." Dr. Chin's expression shifted from skepticism to interest as Sarah continued explaining her reasoning. "The key advantage is that we can position treatment stations closer to where people actually are, rather than requiring injured and traumatized civilians to travel longer distances to reach care. For many disaster victims, transportation itself can be a significant barrier to receiving medical attention." The depth of Sarah's thinking about civilian perspectives and humanitarian considerations impressed not just Dr. Chun, but also Congresswoman Maria Santos, who had been observing the coordination meeting as part of her evaluation of military training effectiveness. Congresswoman Santos had served on the Armed Services Committee for 8 years, but she had rarely encountered military personnel at any level who demonstrated such sophisticated understanding of civilian needs and concerns. As the exercise progressed over the following 2 days, Sarah's distributed medical approach proved remarkably effective. The multiple treatment stations processed patients more efficiently than traditional centralized models, provided faster response times for emergency cases, and created opportunities for military personnel to work more closely with civilian communities. The collaborative relationships that developed between soldiers and civilian medical staff served as a model for the kind of civil-military cooperation that was essential for effective disaster response. But the exercise's most challenging moment came on the second afternoon, when the scenario introduced a complication that tested everyone's ability to maintain humanitarian focus under pressure. Intelligence reports indicated that hostile actors might be exploiting the disaster situation to infiltrate the area with intentions that could threaten both military personnel and civilian populations. The situation required balancing security considerations against the imperative to continue providing humanitarian assistance to people in desperate need. The dilemma created exactly the kind of ethical and tactical complexity that separated competent soldiers from exceptional ones. Some participants focused entirely on security concerns, implementing measures that significantly reduced their ability to provide civilian assistance. Others prioritized humanitarian objectives while inadequately addressing security risks. Sarah recognized that the challenge required integrating both priorities rather than choosing between them. Her solution involved restructuring operations to maintain full humanitarian capability while implementing security measures that were proportionate to the threat level and consistent with legal and ethical requirements for civilian protection. Instead of restricting access to medical facilities, she proposed enhanced screening procedures that could identify potential security risks without creating barriers for legitimate disaster victims. The approach required detailed coordination with civilian law enforcement authorities and military intelligence personnel, as well as careful training for all personnel involved in implementation. Sarah found herself briefing senior officers, civilian officials, and congressional observers about procedures she had developed in real time to address a situation that had never been covered in any training manual. Colonel Patterson watched these developments with growing amazement. In less than 4 months, he had observed Sarah Martinez evolve from an uncertain recruit who seemed physically unprepared for military service into a junior leader who could develop innovative solutions to complex problems under intense pressure. Her performance in this final exercise suggested leadership potential that could benefit the military at levels far beyond what anyone had initially anticipated. During a brief break in the exercise, Colonel Patterson approached Sarah for a private conversation that would prove pivotal for her future military career. "Martinez," he said, "I've been in the Army for 23 years, and I've seen thousands of soldiers at every level of experience. What you've demonstrated over the past few days represents the kind of strategic thinking and ethical leadership that we desperately need in our officer corps." The conversation continued with Colonel Patterson explaining opportunities for advanced military education and leadership development that Sarah had never seriously considered. He described programs where her analytical skills and innovative thinking could be developed into expertise that would influence military policy and strategy at national levels. More importantly, he emphasized that her ability to integrate humanitarian concerns with military objectives represented exactly the kind of balanced perspective that was essential for modern military leadership. But the most significant aspect of their conversation involved Colonel Patterson's acknowledgement of how Sarah's presence had influenced not just her fellow recruits, but the entire training program. "You've changed how we think about identifying and developing military talent," he told her. "Your performance has reminded all of us that the most valuable military capabilities aren't always the most obvious ones, and that real leadership often comes from people who think differently rather than people who think conventionally." The exercise concluded with a formal review session attended by military personnel, civilian officials, and the congressional delegation. Sarah found herself presenting the results of her medical operations not just to military superiors, but to elected officials who would use their observations to make decisions about military training and resource allocation. The presentation required explaining technical military procedures in language that civilian policymakers could understand, while demonstrating how innovative approaches to traditional problems could improve both military effectiveness and humanitarian outcomes. Congresswoman Santos asked pointed questions about resource requirements, scalability, and potential applications in real-world disaster situations. Sarah's responses revealed not just tactical competence, but strategic understanding of how military capabilities could be developed and deployed to serve broader national interests. Her ability to articulate these concepts clearly and persuasively impressed observers who had expected to encounter recruits focused on basic military skills rather than complex policy considerations. The formal evaluation results were announced the following morning during a ceremony that would mark the conclusion of basic training for Sarah's entire company. Individual performance ratings were typically kept confidential, but the exceptional nature of the final exercise had created circumstances where some results would be shared publicly as part of the congressional delegation's assessment of training program effectiveness. Colonel Patterson announced that Sarah Martinez had received the highest overall performance rating in the company's history, achieving perfect scores in leadership, tactical innovation, and civil-military cooperation. More significantly, she had been selected to receive the Distinguished Graduate Award, an honor typically reserved for recruits who demonstrated exceptional potential for future military leadership. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Dr. Chun, the civilian physician who had initially questioned Sarah's medical facility approach, requested permission to address the graduation ceremony. Her comments focused not on military performance metrics, but on the humanitarian impact of the innovative procedures Sarah had developed. In my 20 years of emergency medicine, Dr. Chun said, I have rarely encountered anyone at any level of experience who demonstrated such genuine understanding of how to balance efficiency with compassion. The procedures developed by Private Martinez don't just represent good military tactics. They represent genuine innovation in disaster medical care that could benefit civilian communities nationwide. As Sarah stood with her fellow graduates during the ceremony, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The young woman who had been told she wasn't cut out for military service had not only succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, but had redefined what success looked like in military training. She had proven that exceptional performance could come from unexpected sources, that innovation was as valuable as tradition, and that the most important military capabilities often had very little to do with physical strength or conventional military bearing. The ceremony concluded with individual recognition for outstanding achievement, but Sarah's thoughts were already focused on the challenges ahead. Officer Candidate School would present new tests of her leadership abilities. Advanced technical training would require mastering complex military systems and procedures, and eventual deployment would provide opportunities to apply everything she had learned in real-world situations where the stakes involved more than exercise scores. But as she accepted congratulations from fellow graduates, training personnel, and civilian observers, Sarah Martinez knew that she had already achieved something remarkable. She had not only overcome the doubt that had initially filled every room she entered, but had replaced that doubt with recognition that sometimes the most valuable contributions come from people who approach familiar problems with fresh perspectives and genuine commitment to serving others. The young woman from a small town in New Mexico had become a soldier, a leader, and an innovator whose influence would extend far beyond her individual military career. She had proven that determination and intelligence could overcome physical limitations, that authentic leadership was based on character rather than convention, and that the military's greatest strength lay not in its weapons or technology, but in the diverse talents and perspectives of the people who chose to serve. 6 months after her graduation from basic training, Second Lieutenant Sarah Martinez returned to Fort Benning under circumstances none of her former instructors could have predicted. Her exceptional performance at Officer Candidate School had earned her selection for an elite leadership development program that brought promising junior officers back to training installations to observe and improve training methodologies. She was returning not as a recruit seeking to prove herself, but as a commissioned officer whose innovations were being studied for potential implementation across the entire military training system. The morning of her return began with a meeting that would have seemed impossible when she first arrived as an uncertain recruit. Colonel Patterson, now promoted to full colonel and commanding the entire training brigade, had requested a formal briefing on her experiences in advanced military education and her recommendations for improving recruit training programs. The young woman who had once struggled to get anyone's attention was now being asked to provide strategic guidance that could influence how the military developed thousands of future soldiers. Sarah entered Colonel Patterson's office wearing the gold bars of a second lieutenant, her uniform crisp and her bearing reflecting the confidence that came from months of successful leadership experience. But what struck Colonel Patterson most was not her military appearance, but the quiet intensity in her eyes that suggested she had continued growing intellectually and professionally since leaving Fort Benning. The potential he had recognized in a struggling recruit had developed into genuine expertise that commanded respect from peers and superiors alike. "Lieutenant Martinez," Colonel Patterson said, rising from behind his desk to greet her formally, "I've been following your progress through reports from your instructors at OCS and your current assignment. Your performance has been exceptional, but more importantly, your approach to problem solving has been consistently innovative. I'm hoping you can help us understand how to better identify and develop similar capabilities in future recruits." The request reflected a fundamental shift in how military leadership viewed talent development. Sarah's success had demonstrated that traditional methods of assessing military potential might miss candidates whose strengths weren't immediately obvious through conventional evaluation criteria. Her case had become a model for how the military could adapt its recruitment and training practices to identify and develop diverse forms of leadership capability. Sarah's briefing began with an analysis of her own experience that revealed insights about training effectiveness that surprised even experienced military educators. She had spent considerable time studying why some aspects of basic training had been particularly challenging for her, while others had seemed almost intuitive, and her conclusions suggested opportunities for improving how the military prepared all recruits for leadership responsibilities. The traditional approach to basic training assumes that military competence develops linearly through physical conditioning and compliance with established procedures, Sarah explained, using presentation slides that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of educational theory and practical training methodology. But my experience suggests that the most valuable military capabilities often develop through problem-solving opportunities that encourage recruits to think creatively within disciplined frameworks. Colonel Patterson found himself taking detailed notes as Sarah continued her presentation. Her analysis wasn't just theoretical. It was grounded in specific recommendations for modifying training exercises to better identify recruits who possessed analytical capabilities that might not be apparent through traditional physical and procedural assessments. More importantly, her suggestions were practical enough to implement without fundamentally disrupting established training programs. The conversation continued with Sarah describing her observations from officer candidate school about how different types of intelligence and personality characteristics contributed to military effectiveness. She had noticed that the most successful officer candidates weren't necessarily those who excelled at traditional military skills, but those who could integrate technical competence with ethical reasoning and cultural sensitivity. Her insights suggested that military leadership development could be enhanced by explicitly focusing on these integration capabilities rather than treating them as secondary considerations. But the most significant aspect of Sarah's briefing involved her recommendations for improving how training personnel identified and developed unconventional leadership potential. She had observed that many talented recruits never received opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities because traditional training scenarios didn't create situations where their particular strengths would become apparent. Her suggestions for modified exercise designs could reveal leadership potential in recruits who might otherwise complete training without their capabilities being recognized. Colonel Patterson interrupted the formal briefing to ask a question that revealed how much Sarah's original experience had influenced his own thinking about military leadership. "Lieutenant Martinez," he said, "when you first arrived at Fort Benning, almost everyone assumed you wouldn't succeed in military service. What do you think prevented people, including myself, from recognizing your potential earlier?" Sarah's response demonstrated the kind of self-awareness and analytical sophistication that had characterized her development as a leader. "Sir, I think the problem wasn't that people couldn't recognize my potential, but that traditional military environments didn't create opportunities for that potential to become visible. My strengths involved analytical thinking and creative problem solving, but basic training initially emphasized physical performance and procedural compliance. It wasn't until later exercises created complex scenarios requiring innovative solutions that my capabilities became relevant and noticeable." The answer suggested implications that extended far beyond individual cases. If talented recruits were being overlooked because training programs didn't create appropriate opportunities for diverse capabilities to emerge, then the military might be wasting significant human resources that could contribute to organizational effectiveness. Sarah's recommendations for modified training approaches could help identify and develop these hidden capabilities more systematically. The formal briefing concluded with Sarah presenting a comprehensive proposal for pilot training programs that could test her theoretical recommendations under controlled conditions. Her proposal demonstrated understanding of how to implement changes gradually and measure their effectiveness objectively, rather than simply advocating for wholesale modifications to established procedures. It was exactly the kind of practical innovation that military organizations needed to remain adaptive and effective in changing operational environments. Colonel Patterson's response exceeded anything Sarah had expected when she agreed to return to Fort Benning. "Lieutenant Martinez," he said, "your analysis and recommendations represent exactly the kind of strategic thinking that the Army needs from its junior officers. I'm prepared to authorize implementation of your pilot program proposals, and I want you to personally oversee their development and assessment." The assignment meant that Sarah would spend the next several months working directly with training personnel to modify exercise designs and evaluation criteria based on her recommendations. It was an unprecedented opportunity for a junior officer to influence training policy at the institutional level, but it also represented recognition that her insights were valuable enough to justify significant resource investment and organizational attention. Over the following weeks, Sarah worked with drill instructors, training officers, and educational specialists to design modified training scenarios that could identify and develop diverse forms of military talent. The process required balancing her innovative ideas with practical constraints related to resource availability, safety requirements, and integration with existing training programs. But her collaborative approach and willingness to adapt her proposals based on feedback from experienced personnel created buy-in that ensured successful implementation. The first pilot program was conducted with a company of new recruits who had no idea they were participating in an experimental training approach. The modified exercises created opportunities for recruits to demonstrate analytical capabilities, creative problem-solving skills, and leadership potential that might not have emerged through traditional training scenarios. The results were monitored carefully by evaluation teams that included educational specialists and experienced military personnel. Drill Sergeant Williams, who had been Sarah's initial training supervisor, participated in the pilot program as one of the evaluating instructors. His observations provided particularly valuable feedback because he had direct experience with both traditional training approaches and the modified procedures Sarah had recommended. His assessment would carry significant weight in determining whether the experimental approaches justified broader implementation. The pilot program's most significant success involved identifying leadership potential in recruits who would have been overlooked through conventional evaluation methods. Several participants demonstrated analytical and coordination capabilities that impressed evaluation teams, but which had never become apparent during their initial weeks of training under traditional procedures. The results suggested that Sarah's theoretical insights about hidden military talent were practically valid and could be developed through appropriate training modifications. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of Sarah's approach came from unexpected feedback from the recruit participants themselves. Many reported that the modified exercises had helped them understand their own capabilities more clearly and provided confidence that they could contribute meaningfully to military service. The training modifications weren't just identifying hidden talent. They were helping recruits develop self-awareness and confidence that would enhance their military effectiveness throughout their careers. 3 months after the pilot program began, Colonel Patterson convened a formal assessment review that included senior training personnel, educational specialists, and representatives from military education headquarters. The review would determine whether Sarah's experimental approaches justified expansion to other training installations and potential integration into standard military education procedures. Sarah presented the pilot program results to an audience that included some of the most senior military educators in the country. Her analysis demonstrated that the modified training approaches had successfully identified leadership potential that conventional methods had missed, while maintaining the physical conditioning and procedural compliance standards that were essential for military effectiveness. More importantly, the experimental approaches had improved overall training outcomes for all participants, not just those with previously hidden capabilities. General Patricia Hawkins, the commanding officer responsible for Army training policy nationwide, asked probing questions about resource requirements, scalability, and potential applications beyond initial recruit training. Sarah's responses revealed strategic understanding of how training innovations could be implemented across complex organizational systems while maintaining quality control and consistent outcomes. Her recommendations were sophisticated enough to influence policy at the highest levels of military education. The formal review concluded with General Hawkins announcing that Sarah's pilot program approaches would be expanded to additional training installations for further testing and refinement. More significantly, Sarah herself would be assigned to a newly created position at training headquarters, where she would oversee development of innovative approaches to military education across all service branches. It was an assignment that would allow her to influence how the military identified and developed talent on a national scale. But the most personal moment of recognition came in a private conversation with Colonel Patterson after the formal review session. "Lieutenant Martinez," he said, "when I first met you as a recruit, I saw someone who was struggling to meet basic military standards. What I failed to recognize was that those standards might not be the best measures of military potential. Your success has taught me that good leaders need to be willing to question their own assumptions and recognize that the most valuable contributions often come from unexpected sources." The acknowledgement represented more than professional recognition. It reflected genuine personal growth on Colonel Patterson's part and institutional learning that could benefit countless future military personnel. Sarah's experience had not only transformed her own career trajectory, but had influenced how senior military leaders thought about identifying and developing diverse forms of military talent. As Sarah prepared to leave Fort Benning for her new assignment at training headquarters, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. The young woman who had been told she wasn't cut out for military service had not only succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, but had changed how the military thought about developing leadership capabilities. She had proven that determination and intelligence could overcome initial disadvantages, that innovation was as valuable as tradition, and that the most important military capabilities often had very little to do with conventional expectations. Her final evening at Fort Benning included informal conversations with current recruits who reminded her of herself during those challenging early weeks of basic training. She offered encouragement and practical advice, but more importantly, she served as visible proof that military success could take many different forms and come from many different sources. Her presence alone was evidence that the military valued diverse capabilities, and was willing to adapt its practices to identify and develop unconventional talent. The young woman from a small town in New Mexico had become not just a successful military officer, but an agent of institutional change whose influence would extend far beyond her individual career. She had demonstrated that authentic leadership was based on competence and character rather than conventional expectations, and that the military's greatest strength lay in its ability to adapt and evolve to recognize and develop the diverse talents of people who chose to serve their country. Sarah Martinez had indeed filled the room with something more powerful than doubt. She had filled it with proof that excellence comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most valuable contributions come from the most unexpected sources. The colonel had finally seen what she could do, and that recognition would influence how the military developed leaders for generations to come.